Frances told me a few years later that she was sort of thrilled at the way that Diana sort of freed herself as she saw it.
Fully absorb what they were looking at. What the DNA revealed about the ancestry of Frances Shan Kidd, Princess Diana's mother, is one of the most remarkable stories that modern genetic science has yet produced from the intersection of biology and royal history. It is a story about a secret maintained so carefully and for so long that the people carrying it had entirely forgotten they were carrying anything at all. It is a story about a woman who was erased from the historical record with such thoroughness that her own descendants grew up with no knowledge of her real identity. And it is a story about how a tiny fragment of biological C. In the early 19th century, the city ode, passed silently from mother to daughter across 7 unbroken generations, survived every attempt to suppress it and eventually spoke louder than any document, any official statement, or any carefully constructed family narrative ever could. The story begins not in the drawing rooms of the British aristocracy, but in a bustling trading port on the western coast of India, in a world very far removed from the palaces and estates where Diana's story would eventually unfold. And to understand what the DNA found and why it matters so profoundly, you need to follow it all the way back to where it started. Of Surat in the Gujarat region of western India was one of the most commercially significant port cities on the Indian subcontinent. It sat at the intersection of trading routes that connected the Indian Ocean world to the Arabian Sea, and it had attracted merchants, traders, and commercial adventurers from across the known world for centuries. Armenian traders had established a significant and enduring presence in Surat, building churches, running businesses, and maintaining the kind of community infrastructure that sustained a diaspora merchant class operating far from its geographic origins. British traders, operating under the enormous institutional umbrella of the East India Company, were consolidating their grip on the region's commercial life with a confidence that would eventually translate into full colonial rule. Indian merchants, craftspeople, and working people of every description populated the city's daily life, creating the particular kind of cosmopolitan human mixture that significant trading cities have always produced. It was into this world that a woman named Eliza Kawark was born, around the year 1790. Her background reflected the layered cultural reality of the city she was born in. Her father was almost certainly an Armenian trader, a conclusion supported by her surname, which carries a clear phonetic resemblance to Armenian naming conventions, and by the fact that correspondence addressed to her during her lifetime was written in Armenian script. Her mother, as the DNA evidence would eventually and conclusively establish, was Indian. Eliza herself was therefore a woman of genuinely mixed heritage, shaped by 2 distinct cultural traditions that had found each other in the particular commercial and human melting pot of early 19th century Surat. Into the world Eliza inhabited came a Scottish merchant named Theodore Forbes, born in 1788, the 3rd son of a Scottish family of modest standing. The inheritance conventions of the era were unambiguous and unforgiving. The family estate would pass to the eldest son. The 2nd son might receive some secondary provision. The 3rd son was expected to make his own way in the world through whatever opportunities the expanding British commercial empire could offer a young man of ambition and limited capital. Theodore chose India. He came to work for the East India Company in Surat, seeking the fortune that his birth order had denied him at home, and he arrived in a city that was simultaneously full of commercial possibility and full of the human complexities that colonial commercial enterprise inevitably created. Theodore Forbes employed Eliza Kawark in his household, using the word housekeeper to describe a relationship that the social conventions of the era required to be described with studied vagueness. The arrangement was not unusual. Historical research into the period of British East India Company activity in India has documented extensively the pattern of British men in commercial postings establishing domestic arrangements with Indian women, arrangements that produced children that carried genuine emotional weight on at least one side, and that were almost universally denied the social recognition of legitimate partnership by the men who benefited from them. Theodore and Eliza had 2 children together. A daughter, Catherine, arrived in 1812. A son, Alexander, followed in 1814. Theodore never married Eliza. The documents he left behind described her as his housekeeper and referred to her, in a phrase of remarkable cold-bloodedness, as the purported mother of his daughter. The man questioned in writing the parentage of the woman who had borne his children. That choice of words tells you something specific and deeply unflattering about Theodore Forbes's attitude toward Eliza Kawark and toward the human responsibilities he had incurred through their relationship. What happened next is the part of this story that has haunted everyone who has encountered it since the DNA research brought it back to public awareness in 2013. When Catherine was approximately 9 years old, Theodore Forbes decided to return to Britain. He took Catherine with him. He left Eliza behind. A child was separated from her mother. A 9-year-old girl was taken from the only home she had ever known, transported across the world to a cold and alien country that had no place in its social imagination for the Indian heritage she carried, and told, either explicitly or through the social pressure of everything around her, that her mother was not a subject she would be discussing. Eliza Kawark watched her daughter leave. She never saw Catherine again. What became of Eliza after that separation, how she lived, how long she survived, where she eventually died, whether. Science has a way of arriving uninvited into the most carefully guarded rooms in history. It does not knock. It does not ask permission. It does not consult the preferences of powerful families or the public relations departments of ancient institutions. It simply arrives, carrying evidence that no amount of social management or strategic record-keeping can override, and it places the truth on the table with a calm indifference to who that truth might embarrass or what stories it might permanently disrupt. And when science arrived in the story of Princess Diana's maternal ancestry, what placed on that table was so unexpected, so completely at odds with everything that had been officially recorded and socially accepted across more than 2 centuries, that even the researchers who uncovered it took a moment to she spent the remainder of her life wondering about the daughter who had been taken from her. Whether she had anyone to share her grief with or whether she faced it entirely alone is simply not recorded anywhere that researchers have been able to find. She vanished from history as completely as if she had never existed, which, it turned out, was precisely what the people who came after her intended. Dr. Jim Wilson, the geneticist at the University of Edinburgh who led the research that eventually brought Eliza's story back to light, noted with a plainness that carried its own emotional weight that very little is known about her, including when she died. The 5 times great-grandmother of a future king of England left so faint a trace in the historical record that even the most determined modern research could not reconstruct the basic facts of her final years. She was a real person who lived a real life and felt real things and was treated as though none of that was worth remembering. Catherine Forbes, meanwhile, was absorbed into Scottish society with a thoroughness that only a complete severance from one's origins can produce. She received an education appropriate to her father's social position. She learned the manners and the conventions of the world she had been brought into. She married in Scotland and had children of her own, and those children had children, and the family line continued, moving gradually and then more rapidly up the social ladder of British and Irish aristocratic life, carrying at every step the mitochondrial DNA that Eliza had passed to Catherine in the most intimate biological act of motherhood. The passage of genetic material from mother to child that no social convention and no official document and no carefully maintained family lie could ever intercept or alter. The lie itself was constructed around the impossibility of complete erasure. The people managing the family's social narrative after Catherine arrived in Scotland could not simply pretend she had no mother at all, because too many people already knew that she did. The solution they arrived at was elegant in its practical simplicity, even as it was morally catastrophic in what it did to Eliza's memory and identity. They changed her nationality. They changed her ethnicity. They took the Armenian element of Eliza's background, which was real and documentable and socially acceptable within the framework of Victorian British class consciousness, and they made it the whole story. Eliza Kawark became Armenian. Her Indian heritage, which was equally real and equally documented in her biology, was simply removed. Armenia was exotic enough to explain her presence in the story without being threatening to the social aspirations of her descendants. Being connected to Indian ancestry, in a Victorian Britain that was simultaneously ruling India as a colony and treating its people as fundamentally inferior, was something that could not be acknowledged without catastrophic social consequences for everyone in the family line. So the documents were adjusted. The family stories were refined and retold in their new shape. By the time the generations had passed and the descendants of Catherine Forbes had climbed high enough into British and Irish aristocratic circles that no one was questioning their credentials, nobody in the family remembered anything but the Armenian story. It had been repeated so many times and confirmed in so many family documents that it had entirely displaced the truth it was designed to replace. The chain of women through whom the hidden truth traveled makes for a remarkable genealogical journey. Catherine Forbes, born in Surrey and raised in Scotland, had a daughter named Jane. Jane had a daughter named Ruth. Ruth Gill, as she was known, was a woman of overwhelmingly Scottish heritage by this point in the family's history, but she carried Eliza's mitochondrial DNA as reliably as any of her predecessors had, because mitochondrial DNA does not dilute, does not blend, and does not diminish across generations. It passes intact from mother to daughter across any number of generations, a biological constant in a social story that had been anything but constant. Ruth Gill married Maurice Roche, the fourth Baron Fermoy, a member of the Irish aristocracy, with the kind of social connections that represented a significant step upward in the family's long climb through British social hierarchies. Baron Fermoy was a personal friend of King George VI, the connections of the Roche family stretching into the innermost circles of the institution that would eventually claim Diana. Ruth and Maurice Roche had a daughter named Frances Ruth Roche, and it is with Frances that this story arrives at its most directly familiar territory. Frances Ruth Roche was 18 years old on June 1, 1954, when she married John Spencer, Viscount Althorpe, at Westminster. The scientific discovery that dismantled all of this arrived not dramatically but quietly, in the way that genuine scientific findings tend to arrive, through careful methodology and rigorous analysis, and a willingness to follow the evidence wherever it led regardless of whose comfort it might disturb. Britain's DNA, a Scottish genetic research company, was conducting research into the ancestry of notable British families when its team, working with Dr. Jim Wilson at the University of Edinburgh, began tracing the mitochondrial DNA carried through Princess Diana's maternal line. The researchers did not test Diana directly. She had been dead for 16 years by this point. Instead, they obtained saliva samples from living relatives connected to Diana through an unbroken chain of maternal descent, working backwards through Francis Shandkid's family line to establish what the mitochondrial DNA profile running through that maternal chain actually was. The results were, in the careful language of scientific reporting, extraordinary. The mitochondrial DNA carried through Diana's maternal line contained a haplogroup classification designated R30b. To understand why this was extraordinary, you need to understand how rare this particular genetic marker actually is. At the time of the discovery, the global database of mitochondrial DNA research contained precisely 14 identified carriers of haplogroup R30b. 13 of those 14 individuals were from India. One was from Nepal. There were 0 carriers identified from Armenia. There were 0 carriers from anywhere in Europe. There were 0 carriers from anywhere in the Middle East or Central Asia or any region that might have provided an alternative explanation for how this marker could have entered a family that claimed entirely European and specifically Armenian origins. The evidence, as Dr. Wilson stated in his public announcement of findings, was unassailable. The mitochondrial DNA running through Princess Diana's maternal line traced directly to South Asian ancestry, and the most probable source of that ancestry was the woman who had been recorded in family documents as Armenian but whose biology had never accepted that description. When Britain's DNA made its announcement on June 14, 2013, the global reaction was immediate and enormous. Headlines declare that the future King of England carried Indian DNA. Media outlets around the world ran the story with a combination of genuine fascination and barely contained astonishment that it deserved. The mathematical calculation that followed the announcement established that Prince William was 1/256th Indian by heritage, a fraction that sounds small in numerical terms but carries an enormous weight of historical and human meaning. The response from different quarters of Diana's family to the discovery revealed something important about the distance between the world in which Eliza's secret had been constructed and the world in which it was finally dismantled. Diana's maternal aunt, Mary Roche, was one of the relatives who had provided a saliva sample that contributed to the research. Her public response to learning what that sample had revealed was one of the most genuinely moving elements of the entire story. She told the Times newspaper that she had always assumed she was partly Armenian because that is what the family had always told her, and that discovering she also had Indian heritage had made her feel delighted. She was not distressed. She was not defensive. She did not reach for the protective mechanisms of denial or minimization. She simply felt happy about a truth she had not previously known, and in doing so, she demonstrated exactly the kind of human response that the Victorians who constructed the lie had been so afraid of. The contrast between Mary Roche's warmth and the official silence of the royal family was striking and widely noted. Prince William and Prince Harry made no public comment. Kensington Palace issued no statement. Clarence House said nothing. When William visited India in 2016 on official royal duties, there was no public acknowledgement of the genetic connection between the future king and the country he was visiting, no gesture toward the ancestry the 2013 research had established, no indication that the palace considered the discovery relevant to how the visit should be framed or understood. The British government, which was at the time actively pursuing stronger trade and diplomatic relationships with India, made no apparent effort to use the discovery as the soft diplomacy opportunity it obviously represented. The story simply came and went without any official response from the institution most directly implicated by it. The reasons for that silence are not difficult to imagine. The British monarchy has always been deeply invested in the management of its own narrative, in controlling the stories told about its members and its history with a precision that the word control barely captures. A discovery that placed Indian ancestry in the maternal line of the future king, that traced directly through the mother the world had loved most and mourned most deeply, and that exposed a 200-year-old aristocratic deception about the racial origins of a family that had married into the crown, was not a story the institution was constitutionally equipped to